Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council in Marrakesh for the annual IMF World Bank meetings. We're honored to have with us today Roberta Gatti, Chief Economist for the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank. Welcome, Roberta.
Thank you, Raj. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to be here with you too. So Roberta, in a time of global uncertainty with newly released global outlook forecasts projecting mostly an economic slowdown this year for the world and the region, tell us a little bit more about the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you, Racha, for this big picture question. The Middle East and North Africa region, which for the World Bank spans from Morocco all the way to Lebanon, including also the GCC countries and Djibouti, growth, and we mean real GDP growth, will slow down significantly from a high of 6% in 2022 to a forecast of 1.9% for 2023. So there are at least two ways to look at this picture. The first one is that 2022 was an exceptional year. And this came in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, increases in oil prices, and this high growth was really driven by oil exporting countries. When we look at the slowdown in 2023, it is also driven by the market of oil, and this is because of the coincidence of subsequent cuts in oil production by oil exporting countries in the midst of a demand for oil which was more subdued than expected. And so actually we saw, just starting from October 2022, downward projections for growth after the oil cuts for oil exporting countries. Now, as you know, there are a number of oil importing countries in our region, and also their growth will slow down from 4.9% to about 3.6% for 2023. And what is happening to these countries is they are really grappling with the ripple effects of the global environment of high inflation, high interest rates, and for some of them, significant depreciation of their currencies.
What about the oil exporting economies of the region?
So something that we used to, an expression that we used previously was, there was a tale of two MENAs. MENA is the region, and there were the oil exporting countries that were growing very robustly, and the oil importing countries that were chugging along. I think this tale has come to an end in 2023, and we see a convergence between oil exporting countries and oil importing countries. In particular, GCC countries see a drop from 7.3% to 1% of growth this year, which is something that really highlights the importance of diversifications for these countries. Some of them have made significant progresses already, and others really need to sort of prepare for the future.
Thank you, Roberta. And I saw in the recently released World Bank report titled Balancing Act, Jobs and Wages in the MENA region, the macroeconomic shocks witnessed in the region between 2020 and 2022 are projected to add an additional 5 million unemployed person in the region. This is quite significant considering also that the region has one of the world's highest unemployment rates. So can you please discuss the findings of the report more elaborately?
Happily. So first of all, let's start from something that I think we all believe, that jobs are really at the core of development in the region. What we have done in this report is to look at the past 30 years and look at 70 countries and see what happened to employment, unemployment, labor force participation, and informality vis-a-vis the booms and busts of GDP. And what we have found is that the MENA region is unique in one specific way. Unemployment is much more reactive to economic downturns than comparator emerging market and developing economies. Is almost twice as reactive. So what we found is that looking in the past 3 years, the sort of downturns in GDP brought about 5 more million unemployed people, but if the region had looked like other comparator countries, this number would have gone down to 3 million. So why does this happen? Potentially because there are wage rigidities, including in the public sector, that make the adjustment through quantities, which means through employment, be the margin where things happen. why does this matter? Is because unemployment can carry significant long-term costs, and these long-term costs, you can see them in the earnings of people even 10 years later down the line from when they lost their jobs. You can see it in terms of working in the formal sector and the informal sector. So this is a costly margin of adjustment that happens particularly in MENA vis-a-vis comparator countries.
And Roberta, since you're talking about costs, what are the implications on poverty and inequality in the region, within country and across the region altogether?
So this is a very good question, and what we do in the report, we really try to address the balancing act the policymakers need to make when there are economic shocks that affect negatively demand for labor. What is this balancing act? It's between two non-desirable outcomes. One, that unemployment increases, and the other one is that real wages decrease, and this is when there is inflation and prices grow, then the purchasing power of people, their real income, go down. So how to balance the two? As I mentioned earlier, unemployment is very costly because it carries these long-term scars to people's employment trajectories. Also, impoverishment is costly, but governments can modulate it, and they can compensate it for the most vulnerable by setting in place well-targeted and effective systems of social protection. So what to do? Well, if between the two choices, leave wages to adjust. Do not go for indexing wages, particularly in the public sector, but then really be very purposeful in compensating and helping most vulnerable people through well-targeted cash transfers to avoid that, to avoid seeing significant increases in poverty and inequality.
I see. And you know, in the region, while the entire region is probably going through the slowdown, some economies in particular are struggling already. I'm thinking of Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia. These are all middle-income countries with fast-growing populations, particularly in Egypt, limited fiscal space, and a significantly high level of public debt. So what are the economic opportunities and challenges do you see in these economies, and what should policymakers do to promote economic growth?
This is a very complex question, and this is a very important one. Let me try to sort of think first about the heterogeneity, how these countries, although they're all important countries, they are different. Some of them have high public debt, and they are the ones that tend to suffer the most from the current economic conjuncture. And these are Tunisia, Egypt, to some extent Jordan, and we know that Lebanon has already suffered at that default. So let's think about an economy like Egypt. Egypt now is in a critical juncture. It's at the moment where it will be important for the country to move towards a flexible exchange rate that reflects the fundamentals of the country and that eventually brings the currency to stability. At the same time, this is a country that is in need of significant structural reforms. And these run the gamut, and some of these structural reforms will also be important for others, of increasing female labor force participation. And our chief economist, Inder McGill, was just talking in the previous roundtable and saying country cannot hop on one leg. Yeah. And this is what we see happening in our region. Female labor force participation is the lowest in the world at 20%, which means that only 1 out of 5 women participate to the labor market. So this is something that is fundamental to be able to increase productivity and eventually long-term growth. These countries also need to rethink the role of the state. And for a country like Egypt, it's particularly important to revisit how the state acts in the economy, moving from being a protagonist to being an enabler of private sector growth. And I'm thinking about improved accountability, and I'm thinking about leveling the playing field between state-owned enterprises and the private sector. And then there is a part of managing the economic risk, which in the short term really means to navigate this complicated environment of high inflation and high interest rates, which is particularly relevant for countries that have high public debt. And in the long run, for countries that are oil exporters, and I don't think there was any in that bunch, but there are are in our region, is really to think about economic diversification seriously to get out of this sort of booms and busts way of growing.
And happily, most of the Gulf region is already on a solid plan for economic diversification. So I guess there is a positive outcome of the economic slowdown.
That's what we look forward to
move forward with reforms a little bit faster.
Absolutely, that's what we look forward to, not only for smoothing the growth cycles, but also for the green transition that is so fundamental for the planet.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Roberta. This has been very valuable. I'm sure the audience enjoyed this interview as much as I did. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you, Racha. See you soon.
See you soon.